The rancher's horse came home alone through a blizzard, but the apple tree he had planted for her had been chopped down before sunrise. Snow slammed against the kitchen window as Savannah gripped a silver pocket watch she thought she'd never see again. The stove crackled low. Somewhere outside, 3 slow knocks echoed through the darkness. Her breath caught. The watch was still ticking, but the man who owned it was nowhere in sight. If you love heartfelt Western romance stories, let me know where you're watching from. Spring came late to Cotton Ridge Valley in 1889. The snow had already left the lower hills, but the wind still carried a bite from the Bitterroot Mountains. It swept across the open range, rattling fence posts and rolling red dust down the wagon road that led toward Brooks Ridge Ranch. The ranch sat on a rise above the valley. Once it had been one of the proudest spreads in western Montana. Now it looked tired. Several sections of fence leaned at awkward angles. One barn door hung lower than the other. The paint on the main house had faded beneath years of sun and winter storms. Inside the ranch office, Ethan Brooks unfolded a letter that had arrived on the morning stagecoach. The paper crackled in his hands. He read every line twice. Then he folded it again and slipped it into the drawer without a word. Across the room, Luke Dawson watched him. "Bad news?" he asked. Ethan stared through the window toward the distant pasture. "When was the last time we had any other kind?" Luke didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. The letter came from Kane Mercantile Bank. Final notice. Pay before winter, or lose everything. Outside, a loose shutter banged against the wall. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. 42 years old. 4 years a widower. 4 years since laughter had lived in the house. Most mornings he woke before dawn, drank black coffee, checked the cattle, reviewed accounts, and worked until darkness swallowed the valley. The routine kept him moving. Moving kept him from thinking. That afternoon, a wagon appeared on the south road. Nobody paid much attention at first. Travelers came through often enough. But this wagon stopped at the ranch gate. A young woman climbed down carrying a single worn suitcase. She paused for a moment beside the fence. The wind tugged at her brown coat. Dust clung to the hem of her skirt. Then she picked up the suitcase and walked toward the house. Martha Ellis was shelling beans on the porch. The old housekeeper squinted toward the road. "Can I help you, miss?" The young woman nodded. "Ma'am, I'm looking for work." Her voice was calm, not timid, not demanding, simply tired. Martha looked her over. Travel dust, calloused hands, mended sleeves, the sort of look that came from years of labor rather than bad luck. "What kind of work? Whatever needs doing." Martha studied her for another second. "What is your name?" "Savannah Reed." The old woman noticed something then. The suitcase wasn't heavy, which meant the girl owned almost nothing. Still, she stood straight, like someone who had already lost enough and refused to lose her dignity too. Martha rose slowly. "Come inside." Savannah followed her through the front door. The house smelled faintly of coffee, wood smoke, and old pine boards. It was clean, but empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. The kind of empty that settled after grief stayed too long. Martha led her into the kitchen. A few ranch hands were finishing supper preparations. Nobody spoke much. Everyone worked. Savannah's eyes drifted toward a basket near the back door. Several apples sat inside. Soft. Bruised. Close to spoiling. Martha noticed. "Those are headed for the hogs." Savannah nodded. "Seems a shame." The older woman almost smiled. Almost. Before she could answer, Ethan entered. His boots carried dust from the pasture. His hat shadowed tired eyes. He stopped when he saw the stranger. Martha spoke first. "She's looking for work." Ethan's gaze moved to Savannah. She met it without challenge, without fear, just honesty. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Ethan asked, "Can you cook?" Savannah looked toward the apples. "I can. That's what everyone says." A faint corner of her mouth lifted. "I suppose you'll have to find out." Something about the answer made Martha hide a smile. Ethan studied her another second, then nodded. "We can use help in the kitchen." Relief flickered briefly across Savannah's face, gone almost immediately. "Thank you." Martha showed her a small room near the rear of the house. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a single window overlooking the pasture. Nothing fancy, but safe. Savannah set her suitcase down. Inside were 3 dresses, a Bible, and a worn notebook filled with recipes written in careful handwriting, her mother's handwriting. She touched the cover gently, then closed it. By evening, the kitchen settled into its familiar rhythm. Coffee boiled, beans simmered, a pan of cornbread cooled near the stove. Savannah worked quietly, observing more than speaking, learning where things belonged, learning how people moved around each other. Near sunset, she returned to the basket of apples. Most cooks would have thrown them away. She picked through them carefully, cutting away bruised spots, saving what remained. The smell reached the hallway first. Butter, apples, cinnamon. Something warm. Something familiar. One by one, people lifted their heads. A ranch hand wandered into the kitchen. Then another. Martha stopped kneading dough. "What are you making?" "Pie." The old woman stared. "From those apples?" Savannah nodded. An hour later, the pie came out of the oven. Golden crust, steam curling through the kitchen air. For a moment, nobody spoke. The smell seemed to settle into every corner of the house, into old wood, into faded curtains, into places untouched for years. Ethan arrived after dark. He removed his hat and stopped in the doorway. The scent hit him immediately. Something shifted across his face. Not much, just enough. Martha placed a slice before him. He sat, took one bite, then another. The kitchen grew quiet. Savannah stood near the stove, pretending not to watch. Outside, wind rattled the porch rail. Inside, only the ticking clock moved. Finally, Ethan looked up. "What kind of apples?" "Wild Ridge apples." His fork paused. "My wife used those." Savannah lowered her eyes. "I didn't know." Ethan looked down at the pie again. For the first time in years, he didn't rush through supper. He stayed. Another slice disappeared. Then a third cup of coffee. Nobody mentioned it, but everyone noticed, especially Martha. Later that night, Savannah stood beside her small bedroom window. The moon hung over the valley. Silver light touched the distant barns. For the first time since losing the orchard, she wasn't sleeping in a boarding house, or a wagon, or under a borrowed roof. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a small breath of hope. Far across the ranch, a coyote called into the darkness. The sound faded. The valley settled. Morning arrived cold and gray. Savannah woke before sunrise. She was already tying on her apron when shouting erupted outside. Boots pounded across the yard. A door slammed. Luke Dawson burst into the office carrying a folded sheet of paper. Ethan took one look at it. His jaw tightened. Nearly half the ranch hands had left during the night. No goodbye. No warning. Only a note pinned to the bunkhouse wall. Everyone had heard the same rumor. Brooks Ridge Ranch would be gone before winter. and nobody wanted to go down with it. Ethan stood motionless beside the office window. Beyond the glass, empty horses stood in empty stalls. The ranch suddenly looked larger and lonelier. Behind him, the wind rattled the door, and for the first time since Savannah Reed arrived, the small spark of hope inside Brooks Ridge Ranch seemed in danger of being blown out before it could catch fire. The ranch yard felt different that morning, quieter. The empty bunks in the bunkhouse said more than any letter could. Ethan stood beside the corral fence while Luke handed him the note the men had left behind. The paper was folded twice and stained with coffee. No hard feelings, just fear. Fear that winter would arrive before the money did. Luke shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "We're down to 7 men." Ethan nodded once. The valley stretched before them under a gray sky. 7 men. 2,000 acres. A bank waiting for a mistake. He looked toward the house. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Steady, thin, persistent. "Get the south fence repaired," he said. Luke frowned. "With what crew?" "We still have one." Luke gave a tired smile. Then he headed toward the barn. Inside the kitchen, Savannah was already working. She had been awake since before dawn. 3 glass jars stood on the table, one filled with apple peels, one with cores, one with bruised fruit. Martha watched from the sink. "What are you doing with those?" "Saving them." "For what?" "Vinegar." Martha blinked. "Those scraps?" Savannah nodded. "My mother never threw apples away." The old woman looked down at the peels. "Most folks do. Most folks don't lose orchards." The words slipped out quietly. Martha said nothing. A few moments later, she reached for another jar and placed it beside Savannah. No explanation, no comment. Just help. The kind older women offered when they understood more than they asked. By the end of the week, small changes appeared around Brooks Ridge Ranch. A basket of apple hand pies sat near the front porch each morning. Cowhands grabbed them before heading out. A barrel of apple vinegar began fermenting near the pantry. Savannah turned leftover bread into pudding instead of feeding it to chickens. Nothing dramatic, nothing magical. Just one careful decision after another. Yet somehow the kitchen stopped feeling empty. One evening, a wagon driver passing through Cotton Ridge stopped for supper. The next day, he returned with 2 friends. Word traveled. The ranch served hot meals for travelers, a few coins at a time, then a few more. Martha kept receipts in a small ledger beside the stove. By June, the pages were beginning to fill. Not enough to save the ranch, but enough to make people notice, including Ethan. Most nights he arrived after sunset, dust on his boots, hat in hand, usually silent. He'd sit near the window with a cup of coffee while Savannah finished cleaning up. Sometimes neither spoke for 10 minutes. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It simply existed. One evening she was peeling apples while he reviewed cattle invoices. The lamp flickered softly between them. "You really grew up in an orchard?" Ethan asked. Savannah glanced up. 20 acres. What happened to it? The knife paused. Outside, crickets had begun singing. The bank happened. Ethan lowered his eyes. No further questions. No sympathy. No lecture. Strangely, she appreciated that. A few minutes later, he pushed a plate toward her. The last biscuit. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But she took it. And that seemed enough. Summer settled over Cotton Ridge Valley. The grass grew taller. The evenings stayed warmer. And little by little, the ranch began breathing again. The remaining cowhands stayed longer after supper. Laughter returned to the porch. Someone fixed a broken gate without being asked. Someone else repaired a wagon wheel. Hope moved quietly, like water finding its way through dry ground. Then one afternoon, a black carriage appeared on the road. The horses were polished. The driver wore city clothes. Nobody liked what that usually meant. Savannah was hanging laundry when the carriage stopped. A man stepped down first. Tall, thin, expensive suit, silver watch chain. Walter Kane, the banker. A woman followed him. Elegant black gloves, blue traveling dress, perfect posture. Irene Kane. She carried herself like someone who had never worried about the price of flour. Walter entered the ranch house without waiting for an invitation. Savannah continued hanging sheets, but the kitchen window stood open. Voices drifted through. Low at first, then sharper. 20 minutes later, Ethan walked Walter back outside. Neither man looked pleased. Walter adjusted his gloves. "I admire loyalty, Ethan." Ethan said nothing. Walter smiled. "But loyalty doesn't pay debts." The banker climbed into the carriage. Irene remained behind. Her gaze wandered across the ranch. The barns, the fields, the house. Then finally, Ethan. "I'll be attending church Sunday," she said. Ethan nodded politely. She smiled. "You should sit with me." The silence that followed was answer enough. Yet her smile never faded. The carriage rolled away. Dust followed it down the road. That evening, Savannah carried firewood through the side hallway. As she passed the office, voices drifted through the partially opened door. Walter had returned briefly for forgotten paperwork. Savannah never meant to listen. But one sentence stopped her. Walter laughed softly. "Honestly, Irene, all you have to do is marry him." "What about the girl in the kitchen?" Irene asked. A chair scraped against the floor. Walter's answer came easily. "Push that girl out of the kitchen, and the whole ranch collapses on its own." Silence followed. Savannah stood motionless. The wood pressed against her arms. Then she quietly continued walking. Outside, the evening sun settled over Cotton Ridge Valley. Golden light touched the barns, the corrals, the distant hills. Inside the kitchen, a fresh apple pie cooled beside the window. But for the first time since arriving at Brooks Ridge Ranch, Savannah realized someone else had begun paying attention to her. And whatever Walter Kane wanted, it had very little to do with pie. Summer faded slowly across Cotton Ridge Valley. The grass turned from bright green to pale gold. Dust lingered longer on the roads. The mornings carried a sharper chill before the sun climbed over the hills. At Brooks Ridge Ranch, work never stopped. Neither did Savannah. By September, the shelves of the pantry held rows of apple preserves sealed in glass jars. The vinegar barrels were nearly ready. Travelers stopped by often enough that Martha had started keeping extra flour on hand. The kitchen no longer felt like a workplace. It felt alive. One evening, Luke Dawson carried in a crate of apples from a nearby orchard. He set it beside the table and wiped sweat from his brow. "Festival's 3 weeks away." Martha nodded. "Town'll be crowded." Savannah glanced up. "What festival?" Luke laughed softly. "You've never seen the Cotton Ridge Harvest Festival?" She shook her head. "It's the biggest thing around here. Every autumn, ranchers, farmers, merchants, and families gathered in town. There were livestock competitions, music, wagon races, pie contests, and charity auctions. For many families, it was the most important week of the year. That evening, Martha mentioned an idea. "We could sell pies." Savannah looked surprised. "At the festival?" Martha nodded. "The ranch needs every dollar it can get." Ethan sat quietly near the stove. He didn't interrupt. But when Savannah looked his way, she noticed something unusual. Hope. Carefully hidden, but there. The next morning, preparations began. The kitchen became busier than ever. Flour sacks lined the wall. Apples covered every available surface. Savannah worked from dawn until long after dark. Some evenings, Ethan would enter carrying paperwork and find her still rolling dough beneath the glow of a kerosene lamp. "You should sleep." She never stopped working. "So should you." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. Days passed. Then one afternoon, rain arrived. A slow, steady rain that drummed against the roof and turned the roads muddy. Savannah was stacking cooling racks when she noticed someone standing outside the kitchen window. Irene Kane. The woman stood beneath an umbrella, watching, not smiling, just watching. Their eyes met briefly. Then Irene turned and walked away. Something about it left Savannah uneasy. The Harvest Festival arrived beneath clear skies. Cotton Ridge's main street filled before sunrise. Wagons lined the roads. Children ran between booths. Fiddles played near the church lawn. The smell of roasting meat drifted through town. Brooks Ridge Ranch occupied a small booth near the feed store. Apple pies, apple tarts, apple preserves. Everything Savannah had worked weeks to prepare. Business was strong. People bought pies faster than they could cool. Even Martha seemed impressed. By noon, nearly half the inventory was gone. For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to believe they might survive the winter. Then everything changed. A woman hurried through the crowd carrying a young boy. The child looked pale and sick. Voices spread quickly. Questions followed. Then accusations. Someone claimed the boy had eaten pie from the Brooks Ridge table. Someone else repeated it. Within minutes, whispers moved through the festival like wildfire. People stepped back. Conversations stopped. Customers disappeared. Savannah stood frozen behind the table. The unfinished pie server hung in her hand. Walter Kane appeared almost immediately. Too quickly. His expression carried just enough concern to appear sincere. "What happened?" Nobody answered. The boy's mother pointed toward the booth. People began staring. The silence felt heavier than shouting. Sheriff Ben Turner arrived shortly after. Calm, professional. He spoke to witnesses, examined the remaining pies, collected samples. No accusations. No conclusions. But the damage had already begun. Savannah watched neighbors she barely knew avoid her eyes. People who had praised her cooking only hours earlier now whispered among themselves. The afternoon sun suddenly felt colder. Later, after most of the crowd dispersed, Sheriff Ben entered the temporary kitchen behind the church hall. He inspected one of the flour sacks, then another. His brow tightened. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Ben held up a handful of flour. Dark particles mixed through the white powder. Something that didn't belong there. Someone had tampered with it. The sheriff's voice remained careful. "I don't think this happened by accident." Savannah stared at the ruined flour. A strange numbness settled over her. Because she already knew. She hadn't made a mistake. Someone had done this. But proving it was another matter entirely. That evening, the festival grounds emptied beneath a red sunset. Most vendors packed their wagons. Most families returned home. Brooks Ridge loaded unsold pies back into crates. The ride home felt longer than usual. Nobody talked much. The wagon wheels creaked over dry road. The horses breathed softly in the cooling air. Back at the ranch, darkness settled over the valley. Savannah remained in the kitchen after everyone else left. One ruined pie sat alone on the table. She looked at it for a long time. then quietly carried it outside and threw it away. When she returned, Ethan was standing in the doorway. Neither spoke. The kitchen lamp flickered. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods. Finally, Savannah broke the silence. "You don't have to defend me." Ethan looked at her, his eyes steady, tired, certain. "Yes," he said. "I do." She blinked. "He stepped farther into the room because I know you." The words hung there, simple, honest, and somehow heavier than any speech. For a moment, neither moved. Then a knock sounded at the front door. Sharp, unexpected. Luke entered carrying a leather document case. His face looked grim. "He's here." Everyone knew who he meant. Walter Kane. The banker walked into the ranch office as though he already owned it. He removed his gloves slowly, set a folded contract on Ethan's desk. The paper looked perfectly clean, perfectly legal, perfectly dangerous. Walter tapped the page once. 30 days. The room fell silent. Outside, darkness covered the valley. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked loudly. Walter's voice remained calm. 30 days, Ethan." His eyes drifted briefly toward the kitchen, toward Savannah, then back again. After that, he pushed the contract forward. "You lose everything." The words lingered in the room long after Walter Kane stopped speaking. The banker adjusted his cuffs and waited. Ethan looked down at the paper. 30 days. No extensions. No negotiations. The debt that had once belonged to another lender now belonged entirely to Walter Kane. Outside, the porch boards creaked in the evening wind. Inside, the oil lamp threw long shadows across the office walls. Walter finally smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, just confidently, as if the future already belonged to him. "I suggest you think carefully," he said. Then he collected his hat and left. The front door closed behind him. Silence settled over the ranch house. Luke stared at the contract. Martha stared at the floor. Savannah stood near the doorway, hands folded tightly together. Nobody spoke. The ticking clock seemed louder than usual. Finally, Ethan folded the document and slipped it into a drawer. "We go to work tomorrow." That was all he said, and somehow everyone understood. The next few weeks became the hardest Brooks Ridge Ranch had seen in years. Before sunrise, Ethan was already in the saddle. After dark, he was still reviewing ledgers. Luke organized cattle inventories. Martha stretched every dollar in the pantry. Savannah continued baking, continued selling, continued believing there had to be a way through. October crept across Cotton Ridge Valley. The cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow. Frost began appearing on fence rails each morning. One afternoon, Ethan returned from town, carrying something wrapped in burlap. He left it on the back porch. Savannah discovered it while bringing in firewood. "What is it?" Ethan leaned against the railing. "Open it." She carefully pulled back the cloth. A small apple sapling rested inside. Its roots were wrapped in damp soil. For a moment, she simply stared. The little tree couldn't have been more than 2 feet tall, yet it looked stronger than anything she had seen all week. "Ethan, I found it at Miller's nursery." She touched one of the leaves. It trembled in the breeze. "Why?" He looked toward the distant hills. "Because orchards come back." The answer was simple. Yet something inside it made her chest tighten. Neither looked directly at the other. Neither needed to. They planted the sapling together before sunset, near the kitchen window, where it would catch the morning light. The soil was cold. The wind smelled faintly of winter. When they finished, Savannah brushed dirt from her hands. Ethan stood beside her, close enough to hear her breathing, close enough to say something neither had said before. Instead, he simply nodded. She nodded back, and the moment passed. But not completely. A week later, good news finally arrived. A cattle buyer in Helena was willing to purchase the largest herd Brooks Ridge had ever sold. The contract would clear nearly all the debt. Luke read the numbers twice before believing them. Martha cried quietly in the pantry. Even Ethan smiled, only briefly, but everyone noticed. The trip required Ethan to travel north through Helena and return before the first major snow. 3 days there, 3 days back, if everything went according to plan. The morning of his departure arrived cold and bright. The mountains stood clear against a pale blue sky. Savannah packed food for the journey: biscuits, dried beef, a small apple pie wrapped in cloth. When she handed him the bundle, their fingers touched. Just for a second. Neither moved away immediately. Then Luke appeared with the horses. The moment disappeared. Ethan mounted his gelding. The leather creaked softly. "I'll be back before the next Sunday service." Savannah looked up. "You better." The faintest smile crossed his face. Then he rode away. The road wound north through the valley. Soon he became a dark figure against the open land. Then he disappeared beyond the ridge. For several days, everything seemed normal. Letters arrived from Helena. The cattle sale succeeded. The contract was signed. The debt could finally be paid. Relief spread through the ranch. The first snowfall arrived early on the fourth night. Light at first, then heavier. By midnight, the wind howled across the valley. Snow swept sideways through the darkness. Luke checked the road twice before dawn. No rider, no wagon, nothing. The storm continued. Then another day passed, and another. By the third morning, worry had settled over every corner of Brooks Ridge Ranch. Savannah stood at the kitchen window almost constantly, watching, waiting, listening for hoofbeats. None came. Late that afternoon, a ranch hand shouted from the yard. Everyone rushed outside. A horse was approaching the gate, alone. Ethan's horse. Its coat was covered in snow. The saddle hung crooked. One leather strap had snapped. A dark stain marked the side of the saddle blanket. The animal stopped near the barn and lowered its head. Nobody spoke. The wind seemed to vanish. Even the horses in the corral stood still. Savannah felt her stomach drop. Luke removed his hat. Martha covered her mouth. The valley suddenly felt very large, very empty. Search parties left the next morning. They rode toward Black Raven Pass, toward the cliffs, toward the snow-covered trails. They searched for days. Nothing. No sign. No trace. No rider. No camp. No body. Only endless snow. By the time they returned, Cotton Ridge had already made up its mind. The story spread through town, then across the valley, then beyond it. Ethan Brooks was gone. Walter Kane arrived less than a week later. This time he brought lawyers, documents, witnesses, everything properly stamped and signed. The debt remained unpaid. The ranch now belonged to him. Luke was dismissed. Martha lost authority over the household. Workers loyal to Walter took over the barns. The first thing they did was remove Ethan's name from the office door. The second thing they did was move Savannah out of the guest room. She was given a narrow servant's room near the back storage area. The third thing happened the following morning. Savannah stepped outside carrying a bucket of water. She stopped abruptly. The apple sapling was gone. Only a broken stump remained. Fresh cuts marked the wood. The little tree lay discarded beside the fence, its roots exposed to the cold air. She knelt beside it, touched one torn branch, and said nothing. The silence hurt more. That night, snow drifted against the windows. The kitchen felt colder than ever. Savannah sat alone at the table long after everyone else had gone to bed. One hand rested unconsciously against her stomach. The doctor in town had confirmed it only hours earlier. A child. Ethan's child. A small, fragile life growing quietly inside her. At sunrise, Walter handed her another document. A notice ordering her to leave Brooks Ridge Ranch within 10 days. By evening, she had nowhere left to go. The wind rattled the windows. The stove burned low. And sometime after midnight, as snow whispered across the roof, a sudden knock echoed through the silent house. 3 slow knocks, then silence. Savannah looked toward the door. Her heart began to pound. Someone was standing outside. For several seconds, Savannah didn't move. The wind hissed against the walls of the ranch house. Snow slid across the porch boards. The lamp beside the stove flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the empty kitchen. Then came another knock. 3 slow taps. Nothing more. Savannah rose carefully from her chair. Her hands felt cold, despite the warmth from the stove. She crossed the room and opened the door. An old man stood beneath the porch roof. Snow covered his hat and shoulders. A wool blanket hung across one arm. In the other hand, he held something small wrapped in cloth. "I reckon you're Miss Reed," he said. His voice sounded worn by years of open country. Savannah nodded. The old man stepped inside. He removed his hat. Water dripped from the brim onto the floorboards. "My name's Ezra Miller." She had heard the name before. A sheep rancher from the northern hills. "What brings you here this late?" Ezra looked down at the bundle in his hand, then slowly unwrapped it. Savannah stopped breathing. It was Ethan's pocket watch. The silver case bore the same scratch near the hinge she had seen dozens of times. Her eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" The old rancher pulled a chair closer to the stove. "I found a man near Black Raven Pass." The room became very still. He was half frozen. Couldn't stand. Barely spoke. Savannah gripped the edge of the table. "Ethan?" Ezra nodded. "Alive." The word struck harder than any storm. Alive. Not gone. Not buried beneath snow. Alive. Her eyes filled before she realized it. Ezra continued quietly. "The blizzard took his horse, took his supplies, nearly took him too." He stared into the fire. "I brought him back to my place. Been recovering there ever since." Savannah sank into a chair. For weeks she had carried grief like a stone inside her chest. Now suddenly it cracked open. "When can he come home?" Ezra smiled faintly. "Soon." The old shepherd stayed only long enough to warm himself. Before leaving, he handed her the watch. "Ethan asked me to deliver it." She closed her fingers around the cold silver case. After the door shut behind him, she sat by the stove until dawn, listening to the ticking watch, listening to proof that hope was still alive. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, for the first time in weeks, she slept. The days that followed passed painfully slowly. Walter Kane knew nothing about Ezra's visit. He continued preparing legal papers, continued acting as if Brooks Ridge Ranch already belonged to him forever. The deadline approached. Workers loyal to Walter moved through the ranch with growing confidence. Even Irene Kane returned. She arrived in a dark carriage one bright morning and spent nearly an hour walking through the house, measuring curtains, inspecting furniture, speaking of future renovations, as though the place were already hers. Savannah said nothing. She only carried Ethan's watch inside her apron pocket. Every tick reminded her to wait. Then one cold afternoon, everything changed. The town square of Cotton Ridge bustled with activity. Walter had gathered witnesses, lawyers, businessmen. He intended to finalize ownership of Brooks Ridge before sunset. Snow clouds drifted low over the valley. A bitter wind swept through the streets. People stamped their boots against the cold. Sheriff Ben Turner stood near the courthouse steps, watching, waiting. Walter unfolded documents across a table. His confidence filled the square. "The matter is simple," he announced. "The debt remains unpaid." Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. Then someone pointed toward the western road. Heads turned. A lone rider emerged through the blowing snow. At first he appeared little more than a shadow. Then the horse came closer. The rider sat stiffly, one arm wrapped in a sling. A heavy coat pulled tight against the wind. The square fell silent. Walter's voice stopped. The rider removed his hat. Gasps spread through the crowd. Ethan Brooks had come home. He looked thinner, older somehow. The weeks had left their mark, but his eyes remained unchanged, steady, certain, alive. Savannah felt tears blur her vision. For one suspended moment, neither moved, neither spoke. Then Ethan stepped down from the saddle. His boots touched the frozen ground. The distance between them suddenly felt impossible. She crossed it first. Not running, not crying out. Simply walking. He met her halfway. The square disappeared. The wind disappeared. Everything disappeared. Only Ethan remained. Only the warmth of his hand closing around hers. Only the quiet relief neither could put into words. "I told you I'd come back," he said softly. She laughed through tears. "You took your time." The corners of his mouth lifted. Then his expression hardened. He turned toward Walter Kane. The banker had gone pale, very pale. Ethan reached into his coat, not for a weapon, for papers, contracts, receipts, signed statements, evidence. Weeks spent recovering had also given him time to investigate. The cattle contract had been deliberately sabotaged, transportation arrangements altered, payments redirected, witnesses paid. Every trail led back to Walter Kane. Sheriff Ben reviewed the documents carefully. The crowd watched in silence. When he finally looked up, his decision was immediate. Walter Kane was placed under arrest. No shouting, no struggle, just the quiet collapse of a man whose lies had finally outrun him. Irene left town before sunrise the next morning. No one stopped her. Brooks Ridge Ranch belonged once again to Ethan Brooks. A week later, the first real peace returned to the valley. Snow still covered the fields, but the house felt warm again. That evening, Savannah stood in the kitchen. An apple pie cooled on the windowsill. The same recipe, the same scent, the same memory that had started everything. Ethan entered quietly. The lamp glowed between them. Outside, snow drifted beneath the moonlight. Inside, the pie filled the room with warmth. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan placed a small velvet box on the table. Savannah stared at it. Her breath caught. "Ethan." He looked down briefly, almost nervous, which somehow made her love him even more. "I don't have a church full of people." His voice remained low. "I don't have a fancy speech." He glanced around the kitchen. "This is where the ranch came back to life." His eyes met hers. "And it's where I found mine again." The room grew quiet. Only the crackle of the stove remained. "Marry me, Savannah." Tears filled her eyes. She smiled, then nodded. "Yes." A year later, a baby girl slept beneath a handmade quilt near the kitchen window. Outside, spring sunshine covered Brooks Ridge Ranch. Near the porch stood a young apple tree. The replacement Ethan and Savannah had planted together after winter. Tiny blossoms covered its branches. Inside, travelers shared coffee. Widows found hot meals. Cowhands found shelter. The kitchen never closed its doors. Every evening, the scent of apple pie drifted across Cotton Ridge Valley. And whenever people spoke of Brooks Ridge Ranch, they no longer remembered the banker who tried to own it. They remembered the young woman who arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a recipe book, and the cowboy who discovered that sometimes the strongest thing a person can build isn't a ranch, it's a home. When I think about Ethan and Savannah, I don't remember the bank papers, the storms, or even the long months of uncertainty. I remember a warm kitchen window glowing against a cold Montana evening. I remember the scent of apple pie drifting into the wind. I remember two people who had every reason to give up, yet kept choosing to show up for one more day. And maybe that's why this story stays with us. Because if you place yourself in Ethan's boots, you know what it feels like to carry burdens nobody else can see. And if you stand where Savannah once stood, with nothing but faith, hard work, and a few precious memories, you understand how frightening it can be to start over when the world feels uncertain. Yet sometimes the people who change our lives don't arrive with grand promises. Sometimes they arrive quietly, carrying a suitcase, a kind word, a meal, or simply the willingness to stay. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about saving a ranch at all. Perhaps it's about learning that healing often begins in the smallest places. A shared table, an open door, a hand reaching back when life knocks us down. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about courage, second chances, family, and the kind of love that grows slowly and lasts, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more trails to follow, many more lives to discover, and many more heartfelt stories waiting just beyond the next horizon.